They didn't call a meeting because you're weak. They called it because you don't break. They held a whole meeting about you and still drew a blank. Welcome back, my dear chosen ones. Look at you, still standing in the exact place they swore you'd never return to. They counted you out like it was a hobby. They placed bets on your collapse like it was entertainment. They wrote your ending in their heads, signed it, sealed it, and started celebrating early. And then you did the one thing that hits their ego harder than any insult ever could. You survived, quietly, cleanly, relentlessly. You didn't come back begging for a seat. You came back owning the room without raising your voice. And that's why they couldn't just move on. That's why they couldn't just forget you. Because people don't gather in groups to discuss someone harmless. They don't schedule time, bring opinions, stack stories, and rehearse labels for somebody who doesn't matter. They held a whole meeting about you because your existence is a problem they can't solve with their usual tricks. You are the one equation that won't balance no matter how many lies they plug into it. Let's talk about what really happened. Picture it. A room full of people pretending they're calm, while their fear does push-ups under the table. Their voices get lower, their laughter gets forced, their confidence starts sweating. Because your name is in the air like a warning sign, not because you threatened them, because you reminded them. You reminded them what it looks like when someone refuses to be controlled. You reminded them what it sounds like when someone stops explaining themselves. You reminded them what it feels like when a person outgrows the role you assigned them. Some of you are thinking, why would they even do that? Why would they sit around and talk about me? My dear chosen ones, because you don't fit inside their comfort zones. You don't react on schedule. You don't chase approval like it's oxygen. You don't fold the way they expect people to fold. You don't panic when they withdraw. You don't beg when they go cold. You don't perform when they demand it. And that is a direct attack on their entire method of control. Here's a quote they'll never admit is true. The hardest person to manipulate is the one who's no longer auditioning. That's you. So they did what insecure people always do when they meet something they can't control. They tried to label it. They tried to name you so they could shrink you. They tried to define you so they could dismiss you. They tried to make you sound crazy so they wouldn't have to admit you're clear. They tried to make you sound cold so they wouldn't have to admit you finally have boundaries. They tried to make you sound too much so they wouldn't have to face the fact that they've been living as too little. And the funniest part, they contradicted each other the whole time. One says you're distant, another says you're intense. One says you feel too much, another says you feel nothing. One calls you chaos, another calls you calculated. They're tripping over their own story because the truth is simple. You're not confusing. You're just not predictable. And to people who live off scripts, someone like you feels like a power outage. Before we go any further, pause with me for a moment, chosen ones. If these words are hitting where they're supposed to, if you feel that quiet fire lighting up inside you, then support this movement. Hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and stand with us. Not for numbers, but for momentum. Every like tells us this message reached the right people. Every subscription helps us keep showing up with content that's real, raw, and designed to wake something up inside you. We put real effort into bringing you energy that sharpens your mindset, strengthens your resolve, and reminds you who you are. If this spoke to you, make sure you're part of what's next. You know what you are, chosen ones. You're the storm that ruins the forecast. You're the chess move they didn't study for. You're the locked door that doesn't respond to pressure. You're the software update they can't download because it requires maturity, and they're still running on an outdated version of themselves. And yes, I know what's running through your mind right now. If I'm so powerful, why does this feel heavy sometimes? Because power isn't always loud. Sometimes power is walking away and not turning back. Sometimes power is staying silent while they spiral. Sometimes power is watching them build a whole narrative and realizing none of it can reach you anymore. Sometimes power is being misunderstood and still refusing to explain yourself to people committed to misunderstanding you. Here's the one line that hits them hardest. You didn't lose access to me. You lost the version of me that tolerated you. That's why the meeting happened, because you changed the rules without asking permission. Because you became the kind of person who doesn't argue, just upgrades. Because you stopped trying to be understood by people who only understand control. They sat around a table like a committee, but it wasn't strategy. It was self-defense. It was fear dressed up as concern. And listen closely, my chosen ones. If they're meeting about you, it means you've already won something they can't fake. You've built presence. You've built weight. You've built a name that walks into rooms before you do. You've become the kind of person they can't ignore, can't decode, can't reduce. They tried to turn you into a problem, and all they did was confirm you're the upgrade. So don't shrink now, don't soften now, don't apologize now. Let their confusion be your fuel. Let their meetings be your proof. Let their whispers be your soundtrack. Because when people who don't understand growth try to explain you, they always end up exposing themselves. And before we move any deeper, pause right here with me, chosen ones. If this message feels uncomfortably familiar, if it sounds like things that have already been happening around you, that's not random, that's recognition. Support this space by hitting like and subscribing, because this channel exists for people who don't fit neatly into rooms that try to define them. Drop 77 in the comments if you know you've been watched, discussed and misunderstood, and you kept evolving anyway. Your support keeps this energy alive and allows us to keep delivering content that cuts through confusion and speaks directly to those who feel different for a reason. And now, let's dive in step by step. Because if you're truly a chosen one, what comes next will feel exactly like your own life unfolding in real time. Number 1, the judgment that exposed their fear, not your flaws, when they tried to label you and ended up exposing themselves. They didn't call you a problem because you were wrong. They called you a problem because you refused to stay small. Listen closely, my dear chosen ones. This is the moment where their entire illusion cracked. Not slowly, not quietly. It cracked all at once. They sat around pretending they were in control, pretending they had authority, pretending they were qualified to pass judgment on someone who had already outgrown their understanding. They folded their arms, leaned back in their chairs, and tried to speak about you like a closed case, like something finished, like something they had figured out. But here's where it went wrong for them, and right for you. The moment they tried to label you, they realized they couldn't agree, and that terrified them. They weren't scared of your flaws. Let's clear that up immediately. Everyone has flaws. Flaws are easy. Flaws are manageable. Flaws can be exploited. What they feared, what made the room heavy and the conversation tense, was the version of you that no longer apologized for existing as you are. The version of you that stopped bending. The version of you that stopped explaining. The version of you that didn't need their approval to move forward. That version of you broke their little world. You see, my dear chosen ones, people like them survive on categories. Labels make them feel safe. If they can name something, they believe they can control it. If they can define you, they believe they can limit you. So they tried. They wanted a verdict, a clean sentence they could all nod along to, something that would make them feel powerful again. But when the door closed and the truth was in the room with them, all they could come up with was one weak, shaky conclusion. You're a problem. Not their problem, not a specific issue, just a problem. Floating, uncontained, uncooperative, refusing to sit where they wanted you to sit. And the irony? That was the only thing they agreed on. Everything else turned into chaos, arguments, contradictions, side glances, silence, because deep down they knew what they were really saying. We can't control this person. And that's where your power lives. You don't fit because you stopped reshaping yourself to make others comfortable. You don't blend in because you chose freedom over approval. You don't follow their rules because you realized the rules were designed to keep people manageable, not fulfilled. And here's what they'll never say out loud. You made a choice they were too afraid to make. You chose not to shrink, not to soften your edges, not to round yourself off just to be easier to digest. You didn't announce it, you didn't make speeches, you didn't ask for permission, you simply existed differently, and that alone made their entire rule book feel outdated. Think about how dangerous that is to someone who built their life on fitting in. Every time you walk into a room, you remind them of all the risks they avoided. Every time you speak honestly, you remind them of all the truths they swallowed. Every time you stand firm, you remind them of all the times they folded. You are not just a person to them, you are a mirror, and not a flattering one. That's why they gathered, that's why they debated, that's why they talked in circles until they exhausted themselves, because you represent something they don't know how to handle, someone who thrives outside their framework. Someone who grows without validation, someone who walks through life unshaken by opinions that once controlled them. And here's the question I know is forming in your mind right now. Chosen ones. Why does my existence bother them so much? Because you ruin their favorite excuse. That's just the way things are. You proved things can be different. You proved someone can walk away and still rise. You proved peace doesn't come from belonging. It comes from being real. That realization is brutal for people who traded authenticity for acceptance. You break them without touching them. You confuse them without speaking. You threaten them without trying. You expose them without pointing a finger, and that's why they resent you. But here's the twist. Listen carefully. They don't actually hate you. They hate what you reveal about them. They see the courage they fumbled, the boldness they buried, the potential they abandoned, the rebellion they never allowed themselves to taste. Calling you a problem was the safest thing they could do, because calling you powerful would require them to confront their own collapse. Calling you evolved would force them to admit they stayed stuck. Calling you free would expose how confined they feel, so they chose the label that protected their fragile world. But here's what they didn't calculate. The more they tried to define you, the more undefined you became. The more they tried to shrink you, the more space you filled. The more they tried to predict you, the faster you evolved. The more they tried to control the narrative, the more the narrative exposed them. You're not a problem. You're a disruption. You're the glitch their system can't fix. The update their mindset can't download. The storm that doesn't follow their forecasts. And yes, you've felt it. The sideways glances, the hesitation, the shift in energy when you enter spaces that used to feel normal. People treat you like someone who knows something they don't, because you do. You know that life isn't about fitting in. You know approval isn't survival. You know you're not here to be convenient, and that knowledge alone puts you miles ahead of them. So when they say you're a problem, understand what it really means. Problems don't scare legends. Problems don't scare people who are rewriting the rules. Problems scare those who never learned how to face reality. You're not their problem, you're their consequence. Number 2, the closed-door discussion that fell apart. The moment your name was spoken. When your name entered the room and everything fell apart. They didn't meet to understand you. They met because your existence makes their structure unstable. My dear chosen ones, understand this clearly. You were never the topic of that meeting. You were the pressure that made it collapse. They didn't gather because they were curious. They gathered because something about you disrupted their balance, their hierarchy, their sense of control. Picture it clearly: a long table, polished to look impressive. A room designed to project confidence. People sitting straighter than usual, not because they're proud, but because tension is holding their spines hostage. Calm faces, tight jaws, eyes that keep drifting toward the door, not because they expect you to walk in, but because some part of them knows, if you did, everything they built would feel fragile. That's the scene. A whole group assembled around one person who wasn't even present. And the moment they sat down, the atmosphere shifted. You know that silence that creeps in when something important is missing? This wasn't respect. This was fear disguised as professionalism. Chairs made noise like they were nervous. Papers shuffled for no reason. Screens glowed while minds raced. And no one wanted to be the first to ask the real question hanging in the air like smoke. Who here actually understands them? No one spoke, because no one could answer. Here's a quote you need to remember. Chosen ones. Every lie told about you was an admission they didn't intend to make. People fear what they can't predict, and you became their personal plot twist. They weren't analyzing you. They were bracing themselves against you, because when you walk into a room, masks stop fitting. That's not arrogance, that's presence, that's authenticity clashing with performance. Someone eventually tried to sound brave, cleared their throat, said the words they rehearsed in their head, "Let's talk about the you problem." And the room froze. Instant regret. Saying your name out loud felt like invoking something they didn't have the tools to handle. And then the labels started flying, fast, sloppy, desperate. Big words thrown like shields. Psychological terms used like weapons. Too intense, too distant, too emotional, too cold, damaged, unstable, dangerous. It sounded like people throwing rocks into the dark, praying something would hit. But nothing did. Not one label stuck. Everything slid off you like rain on steel. And that's when panic crept in, because they realized something terrifying. They weren't diagnosing you. They were defending themselves. They weren't trying to understand who you are. They were trying to protect their own fragile sense of reality from a version of you they couldn't decode. You might be wondering right now, why would I need a whole meeting just to be talked about? Simple. Your existence doesn't follow their rules. You don't collapse the way they collapse. You don't beg when pressured. You don't chase validation when things get uncomfortable. You don't shrink when power is flexed. You get quieter, sharper, more focused. And that terrifies people whose strength only exists when others react. That meeting wasn't strategy. It was damage control. Imagine scientists holding containers of unknown substances, labeling everything dangerous because they don't understand how it behaves under heat. You are that heat. Or imagine people arguing about what's inside a locked chest. Gold, a weapon, nothing at all. But no one opens it because they're afraid of being wrong. You are that chest. Or think of gardeners complaining that a wildflower won't grow like their manicured roses, forgetting the wildflower survives storms that destroy the garden. That's you, chosen ones. That's why the meeting unraveled. The deeper they went, the more their fear exposed itself. They weren't describing you. They were describing their insecurities. Your intensity reminded them of their emotional laziness. Your independence exposed their neediness. Your depth highlighted their shallowness. Your consistency revealed how quickly they fold. Your mystery showed them how predictable they are. That's the real problem you represent. Here's the truth that hits hardest. They didn't gather to figure you out. They gathered to protect themselves from the reflection you create. Every label they threw came back like a boomerang. Too intense. Translation: your clarity intimidates them. Too cold. Translation: you removed access they didn't deserve. Unpredictable. Translation: you don't follow their script. Dangerous. Translation, you can't be manipulated. And yes, they're right about one thing. You are dangerous, but not to people, not to peace, not to progress. You're dangerous to lies, dangerous to manipulation, dangerous to weak boundaries, dangerous to systems built on control and shallow approval, dangerous to fragile egos that survive on gossip and noise. They spent hours trying to categorize you and proved one thing instead. They're not equipped to understand someone like you. You don't fit their language. You don't fit their theories. You don't shrink to match their comprehension. And hear this clearly, chosen ones, you're not misunderstood. They're underdeveloped. If you've ever asked yourself, why do people watch me like this? Why do they study me, talk about me, treat me like a threat when I've done nothing? This is why. You disrupt their blueprint. You remind them that not everyone is controllable. Not everyone fears isolation. Not everyone breaks the same way. Not everyone needs validation to function. That meeting wasn't calm. It wasn't productive. It was a meltdown dressed up as discussion. They wanted to reduce you. Instead, they exposed themselves. They wanted to decode you. Instead, they scrambled their own logic. They wanted a narrative. Instead, they cracked under the weight of your truth. Remember this line: you're not the chaos. You're the clarity that ruins their illusions. They didn't gather to solve the you problem. They gathered because you are the one variable they can't predict, can't categorize, and can't defeat. And the part that eats at them the most, you weren't even there. Number 3, the deep dive into you that ended with them questioning themselves. They dug for a weak point and found proof they never stood a chance. They went looking for the moment you broke and discovered you never did. Listen carefully, my dear chosen ones, because this is where their confidence collapsed completely. This is where their so-called investigation turned into embarrassment. They truly believed there had to be a single moment that explained you. One event, one trauma, one mistake they could point at and say, that's it, that's when they cracked. Because if they could reduce you to one incident, they could finally stop feeling threatened by what you've become. So they went digging. Not to understand you, but to disarm you. They scrolled through your past like it was evidence in a cheap crime show, convinced they'd find the scene of the collapse. They replayed old stories, old versions of you, old reactions, old pain, hoping to catch you frozen in a moment of weakness. They wanted a clean narrative because clean narratives are easy to dismiss. Something broke them. They never recovered. This is just trauma acting out. That story would have made them feel smarter, safer, superior. But here's where it backfired. Every time they thought they found the origin point, it slipped through their fingers. Every theory collapsed under its own weight, because there was no single moment, no dramatic fall, no permanent fracture. What they ran into instead was something they weren't equipped to process: continuity, growth, adaptation, evolution. You weren't shaped by one tragedy. You were sharpened by every storm they assumed would end you. Betrayal didn't break you, it refined your discernment. Loss didn't empty you, it expanded your depth. Rejection didn't weaken you, it taught you precision. You didn't snap, you adjusted. You didn't collapse, you recalibrated. And that reality made them deeply uncomfortable. Chosen ones, this is where they lost control of the narrative, because their entire framework depends on people breaking in predictable ways. They know how to deal with collapse. They know how to exploit insecurity. They know how to manipulate unhealed wounds. What they don't know how to handle is someone who processes pain without becoming owned by it, someone who doesn't stay stuck in survival mode, someone who learns, integrates, and moves forward quietly. They were searching for a crack, not realizing they were staring at something forged. And let's be clear, strength like yours doesn't come from avoiding heat. It comes from enduring it repeatedly, like a blade that's heated, hammered, cooled, and reforged again and again. You didn't come out fragile. You came out tempered, flexible enough not to snap, solid enough not to bend. That's why their investigation turned into panic. Because at some point, someone in that room, the quiet one, the observant one, the person who notices patterns instead of gossip, said the sentence no one wanted to hear. What if the problem isn't them? What if the problem is us? That wasn't analysis. That was exposure, and the room felt it instantly. What if you didn't malfunction? What if you upgraded? What if you didn't fail the system? What if you outgrew it? What if you weren't damaged at all, but incompatible with environments that never evolved? Silence followed, the kind that lingers, the kind that burns, because deep down, they knew it was true. You didn't stop fitting because something went wrong with you. You stopped fitting because you refused to stay at a level that demanded self-betrayal just to belong. This is the part I want you to hear clearly, chosen ones, because many of you have wondered about this yourself. Why do people keep trying to psychoanalyze me? Why do they search my past like it holds a secret? Why do they seem disappointed when they can't find a clear weakness? Because understanding you would require them to confront their own stagnation. And that's a price they don't want to pay. They needed you to be broken so they could feel intact. They needed your story to end so theirs could feel justified. They needed a label that explained you away so they wouldn't have to question their own choices. But instead of finding damage, they found depth. Instead of finding dysfunction, they found adaptation. Instead of finding a victim, they found someone who refused to stay small, and that realization unsettled them. Because if someone like you can endure pressure without becoming bitter, if someone like you can experience loss without losing direction, if someone like you can walk through chaos and come out clearer, then their excuses fall apart. They can't say, "That's just how life is," anymore. You proved life responds differently to those who refuse to collapse. You proved growth doesn't need permission. You proved resilience isn't loud, it's consistent. You proved evolution doesn't announce itself, it shows up. So their investigation ended the only way it could, with no conclusion and a lot of discomfort. They didn't uncover your weakness, they uncovered their limitation. They didn't find the moment you broke. They found the moment they realized you never did. You weren't shaped by one tragedy. You were shaped by endurance, and that's something their system was never built to understand. Number 4, the uncomfortable truth you reflected that they refused to face. You became the mirror that made them uncomfortable. They didn't turn you into the villain because you crossed a line. They did it because you erased their excuses. Listen carefully, chosen ones. This part cuts deeper than anything before it, because this is where the truth stopped being theoretical and started becoming personal for them. They didn't fear your actions. They didn't fear your words. They feared the reflection you created the moment you stopped pretending, the moment you stood fully as yourself, without shrinking, without over-explaining, without softening the truth just to keep the peace. Something inside them cracked, not loudly, quietly, the kind of crack that spreads slowly and ruins the entire structure. They couldn't say it out loud, but everyone in that room felt it. You weren't a threat in the traditional sense. You weren't attacking them. You weren't competing. You weren't even engaging. You were something far more dangerous to people who rely on illusions. You were a mirror. And not the kind you can tilt to your good side, the kind that shows everything exactly as it is. And that's what made their stomachs twist. Because when they looked at you, they didn't see a villain. They saw the version of themselves they abandoned years ago, the version that wanted more, the version that asked uncomfortable questions, the version that once had courage before it was trained out of them. They tried to dissect you, analyze you, reduce you to something manageable. But the deeper they looked, the clearer it became that the discomfort wasn't about you at all. It was about what your existence forced them to confront. Your presence asks questions without speaking, questions they've spent their entire lives dodging. Why am I still stuck? Why did I choose safety over growth? Why did I silence myself to stay accepted? Why did I settle? And the one question that hits hardest of all, why can they do what I never dared to? Chosen ones, this is where your power truly lives. You are the walking contradiction to everything they built their identity around. You prove that strength doesn't come from applause. It doesn't come from being understood. It doesn't come from fitting in or being praised. It comes from surviving without validation, from standing steady when no one claps, from choosing honesty even when it costs you comfort. And that's why they hate looking at you, because you destroy the lie they've been clinging to for survival. The lie that playing small keeps you safe. The lie that staying quiet protects you. The lie that blending in is the same as belonging. You expose how fragile that belief really is just by existing openly. You don't preach it, you don't announce it, you embody it. And embodiment is terrifying to people who live behind masks. Imagine this clearly: a dim room, a cracked mirror hanging on the wall. They've been standing in front of it for years, comfortable with the distortion, comfortable with how it hides the cracks. Then you walk in holding a clean, unbroken mirror. You don't point it at them. You don't accuse. You don't explain. You simply exist. And suddenly, their excuses stop working. Their illusions look cheap next to your clarity. Their carefully curated identity flickers like bad lighting. Nothing about them feels solid anymore. So what do scared people do when reality corners them? They project, they point fingers, they rewrite the story. They turn the mirror into the villain. You became the easiest target, not because you were wrong, but because admitting the truth would mean tearing down the entire house of lies they've been living in. It's much easier to say you're too much than to admit they're not enough. It's much easier to label you difficult than to face their own fear of growth. It's much easier to call you the problem than to accept responsibility for the life they chose. Here's the punchline they'll never say out loud: chosen ones. They don't fear who you are. They fear who they could have become if they hadn't betrayed themselves. They fear the courage they buried, the honesty they avoided, the risks they refused to take. You are living proof that another path existed, and that realization eats at them in silence. You aren't the villain. You're the reflection they can't stand to face. You are the reminder that they chose comfort over evolution. You are the evidence that growth demands honesty, and honesty is their weakness. Not because it's cruel, but because it requires accountability. So yes, in their story, you're the problem. Not because you're wrong, but because you're real. And chosen ones, understand this clearly before we move forward. When people react to you like this, when they study you, whisper about you, or quietly turn you into something dark in their minds, it's not a curse. It's confirmation. You didn't disrupt their peace. You exposed how fragile it always was. Stay with me. Because if this feels familiar, what comes next will explain even more of what you've been sensing all along. Number 5. The backhanded label that accidentally put you above them, when being called the problem is actually the crown they didn't mean to give you. When the wrong people label you a problem, it's not an insult, it's evidence. My dear chosen ones, this is where the irony sharpens into something undeniable. After all the meetings, the whispers, the side conversations, the careful tone changes, and the desperate attempts to reduce you into something manageable, they landed on the weakest conclusion possible. One sentence, one label, one flimsy story they now repeat to themselves like a lullaby meant to calm their fear. You're the problem. That's it. That's all they could come up with. And if that doesn't tell you everything you need to know, nothing will. Think about it. People don't cling to strong conclusions. They cling to fragile ones. They repeat them because they're scared of what happens if they stop. That label isn't confidence, it's a life raft. It's the only thing keeping their world from collapsing under the weight of your existence. Because if they admitted anything else, if they admitted you're ahead, evolved, uncontainable, or simply beyond them, their entire sense of control would cave in. So they chose the story that felt safest, even if it barely holds together. And yes, chosen ones, it hurts and validates you at the same time. That contradiction is not weakness, it's awareness. Part of you feels the sting because you're human. Another part of you recognizes the truth hiding inside their judgment. You were never designed to fit neatly into places built on fear and sameness. You were built to disrupt patterns that no longer serve growth. And disruption always looks like danger to people who worship stability more than progress. They hoped that calling you the problem would shrink you. They expected it to humble you, quiet you, put you back into the small box where they felt smarter, stronger, and in control. They imagined that label would weigh you down. Instead, it did the opposite. It exposed how intimidated they really are, because calling someone like you the problem is a confession. It's an admission that their system can't handle pressure, that their structure cracks when something real walks in. Let me put it in a way that's impossible to ignore. Imagine a house built on weak foundations. For years it stands, not because it's strong, but because nothing challenges it. Then the ground shifts slightly. The house doesn't blame the poor construction or the years of neglect. It blames the earth. That's you. You are the shift. The movement that reveals the weakness that was already there. Not the cause of the damage, the proof of it. Or imagine a chessboard where every piece moves the same way, following familiar patterns, comfortable routines. Then there's one piece that moves differently, changes the flow of the game, forces everyone else to rethink their strategy. Do they question the board? Do they question the rules? No. They try to exile the piece, not because it's wrong, but because it's powerful, because it forces evolution. That's what you do without even trying. Here's the quote that cuts through all of it. The more they try to shrink you, the more they reveal how small they are. Their attempt to make you the problem didn't reduce you, it crowned you. It placed you at the center of their conversations, their fears, their insecurities, their sleepless nights. Your name became something they couldn't ignore, something that lingered long after the meeting ended. They wanted to restore order. Instead, they created a legend inside their own minds. And let's answer the question you're probably asking yourself right now, chosen ones. Why does this keep happening to me? Why do people react like this? Because growth exposes stagnation. Because clarity threatens confusion. Because someone who doesn't need permission destabilizes people who built their lives around asking for it. You don't attack their world, you outgrow it. And that's far more dangerous. What they call a problem is actually an upgrade they can't install. You move too fast for their outdated systems. You think too clearly for their emotional shortcuts. You see too much for their comfortable illusions. And rather than admit they're behind, they label you disruptive, not realizing that disruption is how progress has always arrived. So when they whisper your name with concern, when they sit in rooms trying to figure you out, when they repeat that hollow verdict to make themselves feel safe, remember this. Crowns are often placed accidentally. They didn't mean to elevate you. They didn't mean to make you unforgettable. But by failing to understand you, they did exactly that. You're not the problem, chosen ones. You're the plot twist that exposes the entire script. And the more they try to contain you, the clearer it becomes. You were never meant to be contained at all. Number 6. The quiet talk about you that refused to stay quiet. The talk that refused to die. When your name keeps moving after you've already left the room, that's not gossip, that's impact. My dear chosen ones, this is the part they never planned for. They thought the meeting was the end. They thought once the door closed, once the chairs scraped back and everyone went their separate ways, the tension would dissolve and your name would finally rest. But instead, something far more dangerous happened for them. The whispers began, quiet at first, incomplete, half-formed, the kind of whispers that don't carry facts, only energy. And energy spreads faster than truth ever could. The people who weren't even in the room felt it. They noticed the odd pauses in conversation, the strange looks exchanged when your name slipped out, the way voices lowered instinctively, like someone might overhear something they weren't supposed to know. And that's how it always starts. Not with explanations, but with curiosity, not with answers, but with tension, because nothing grips the human mind harder than a mystery it's not allowed to touch. Suddenly, people who barely knew you leaned in closer when your name came up. People who had ignored you, overlooked you, underestimated you, started replaying every interaction they'd ever had with you, not because you asked them to, because now they were wondering what they missed. They searched their memory like investigators combing through old footage, asking themselves, how did I not see it? That question alone is powerful, chosen ones, because it shifts the narrative from who are they to what did I overlook? And then came the thought that electrified them all. What kind of person makes a whole room gather just to talk about them? Meetings aren't held for nothing. Meetings are for problems, for crises, for things that can't be ignored. Meetings are for storms you can't outrun. And somehow, without even being present, you became the center of one. That realization hit harder than any insult ever could. Here's the truth they'll never say out loud, but feel in their chest every time your name resurfaces. Only a force gets studied. Only a threat gets monitored. Only something powerful enough to disrupt gets whispered about. Ordinary people don't create ripples after they leave. Replaceable people don't live rent-free in conversations they're not part of. You do, and that's why the whispers won't die. You know what they're really asking themselves, even if they never speak it. What did they do that was so different? How strong does someone have to be to leave that kind of mark? If multiple people still couldn't figure them out, what kind of presence do they carry? If the room shifted after they left, what does it take to become someone who can't be simplified, reduced, or dismissed? Those questions don't stay in one place. They echo through side conversations, through private messages, through group chats where your name appears without context and disappears without resolution. And every time it happens, the legend grows. Not because you're trying to be remembered, but because they can't let you go. You're the anomaly, chosen ones, the unsolved equation, the variable that doesn't behave the way it's supposed to. They keep trying to plug you into formulas that worked on everyone else, and nothing balances. And that drives them insane. Because people like them rely on predictability to feel safe. You removed that safety just by being yourself. Think of your name like wildfire. It doesn't move in straight lines. It jumps. It spreads unexpectedly. One person hears a fragment, another adds a tone, another senses the weight behind it. And suddenly there's a story no one can fully explain. Not because it's exaggerated, but because it's incomplete. And incomplete stories are irresistible. Every person who hears about the you problem becomes quietly obsessed with figuring out why you're so hard to categorize. Why you didn't break the way others break. Why you didn't shrink when pressure hit. Why you didn't dull yourself down to fit into rooms that were never built for you. Your refusal to fold makes people question their own flexibility. Your refusal to perform makes people wonder how much of their life has been an act. And here's the part that really gets under their skin. You're not chasing attention, you're not feeding the rumors, you're not correcting the narrative, you're moving forward while they're still talking. That silence, that's gasoline on the fire. Because when someone doesn't defend themselves, insecure minds assume there must be something even bigger they don't know. Let me answer the question you might be asking yourself right now, chosen ones. Why does this keep happening to me? Because you carry presence, because you disrupt patterns without effort, because you don't disappear just because someone stops inviting you into rooms. Your absence is louder than their presence. You're not just unforgettable, you're undeniable. And that's why the whispers don't fade. They multiply, they evolve, they outgrow the people who started them. And while they're busy trying to understand why your name still circulates, you're already 3 steps ahead, living, building, becoming. Remember this, and let it settle deep. When your name travels faster than your footsteps, you've already won. Number 7. The breakdown of a system that was never built to handle someone like you. When the system froze, because you didn't need it. They didn't fail to understand you. Their system failed the moment you showed you could live without it. Listen carefully, chosen ones, because this is where their confidence completely collapsed. They didn't walk into that room to admire you. They walked in convinced they could handle you, fix you, neutralize you, reduce you to something manageable. They honestly believed that with enough talking, enough notes, enough opinions stacked on top of each other, they'd come out with a neat little plan, a blueprint, a checklist, something that would put you back into a box they understood. You were supposed to be a minor inconvenience, a glitch they could patch with teamwork and surface-level thinking. But the moment they tried to run their system against you, it crashed. Not slowly, not gracefully, it froze, hard. Imagine people who are used to acting like experts suddenly staring at each other with empty eyes. No confidence, no answers. Just that quiet panic that hits when you realize none of your tools work anymore. That's what happened. Their entire architecture of control flickered. The rules they rely on stopped responding. The patterns they memorized failed. The formulas they trust returned nothing but confusion. They expected logic. They got chaos. They expected predictability. They got a phenomenon. They expected a problem to solve. They got a force they couldn't even define. And here's the truth they didn't want to face. You didn't confuse them. You exposed how shallow their thinking really is. Chosen ones, hear this clearly. You are not a riddle. Riddles have answers. You are not a maze. Mazes have exits. You are not a code. Codes can be cracked. You are something else entirely because you're not playing a game they recognize. You're not following the same axis. You're not moving in the same direction. You're not even using the same map. You're living your life from a place they never developed access to. Self-evolution. That's why nothing worked. They tried to track you, but the trail disappeared the moment you moved. They tried to study your patterns, not realizing patterns don't exist when someone evolves faster than observation. They tried to predict your next step, completely missing the fact that you stopped moving on the wheel they're still running on. You didn't zig when they expected zag. You didn't repeat. You didn't react. You recalibrated. And that's what broke everything. Here's a metaphor that hits them right where it hurts. They spent their lives memorizing roads. You burned the road behind you and learned how to survive in the wilderness. While they argue over directions, you adapt to terrain. While they cling to systems, you move by instinct, sharpened through experience. And systems hate people like you, not because you attack them, but because you don't need them. That's the real glitch. They expected to categorize you. Instead, they encountered something uncategorizable. They expected control. Instead, they found fascination mixed with fear. They expected simplicity. Instead, they found depth they couldn't reach. The system didn't break because you disrupted it. It broke because it was never built to handle someone independent of it. Chosen ones, I know the question forming in your mind right now. Why does this keep happening to me? Why do people freeze, overthink, or malfunction around me? Because you operate from a place beyond scripts. You're not waiting for instructions. You're not following outdated rules. You're not asking how to fit in. You're asking how to grow. And that mindset alone makes you incompatible with environments built on control, repetition, and fear of change. You speak a language you had to build yourself, not from privilege, not from comfort, from survival, from being underestimated, from being misunderstood, from having to adapt when no one explained the rules to you. And now the same people who dismissed you are scrambling because they don't understand how you move so fluidly through uncertainty. Their system was designed for dependence. You represent autonomy. That's why it glitched. And here's the part that really unsettles them. You didn't even try to break it. You didn't rebel loudly. You didn't announce your independence. You simply stopped needing what they were offering. And the moment you did, their authority evaporated, their leverage disappeared, their relevance faded. Systems only work when people believe they need them. You walked in as living proof that belief was optional. So if you felt people watching you like you're unpredictable, studying you like you're dangerous, or talking about you like you're a problem they can't solve, understand this. You're not malfunctioning. You're functioning at a level they never prepared for. They call it chaos because they can't control it. They call it strange because they can't replicate it. They call it a glitch because it exposes the cracks in everything they rely on. Chosen ones, you are not here to be processed. You are not here to be categorized. You are not here to be optimized for someone else's system. You are the reminder that some people don't fit into frameworks because they were meant to outgrow them. The system didn't fail because of you. It failed because you showed it wasn't necessary. Number 8. The moment you stopped playing along and everything shifted. When you changed the rules by walking away from the board, they didn't lose control because they got weaker. They lost control because you stopped playing. My dear chosen ones, this is the moment everything broke for them and finally aligned for you. Not loudly, not with an announcement, not with a dramatic exit they could gossip about. It broke the moment you stopped reacting. That's the part they never prepared for. They built their entire reality on one dangerous assumption, that you would always respond, always adjust, always orbit their expectations. And for a long time, the game worked because you participated, not because it was fair, not because it was right, but because you were still trying to be understood inside a system that was never designed to understand you. They thought the world would always bend around their rules, their hierarchies, their definitions of who gets to rise and who gets told to wait their turn. They believed power came from pressure, that silence could be forced, that approval could be withheld like currency. And then something happened that shattered their confidence at the root. You stopped shrinking when they flexed. You stopped explaining when they questioned. You stopped proving when they doubted. You stopped reacting, and that single shift collapsed their entire structure. Chosen ones, let me say this clearly, people who rely on control panic when they meet someone who no longer needs permission. When you stepped out of their gravitational pull, everything tilted. Not because you attacked them, but because you disengaged. Imagine a planet suddenly changing its orbit. The pull that once felt inevitable disappears, and everything that depended on that pull starts drifting, unstable and exposed. That's what happened to them. Every prediction they made about you failed overnight. Every strategy they used stopped working. Every assumption they held shattered the moment you changed frequencies. They tried to engage you on their terms, rules that only existed as long as you respected them. But the second you stopped operating from fear, those terms dissolved. Their manipulation didn't land. Their guilt didn't stick. Their shame tactics lost traction. What used to sting now evaporates before it reaches you. It's like throwing pebbles at a mountain and calling it an attack. And this is where their fear turns quiet and personal. Not the dramatic kind, not the loud kind. The kind that keeps people awake at night, staring at the ceiling, replaying moments, asking questions they avoided for years, because the truth finally hit them. You don't exist in their world anymore. You built your own. That realization is devastating to people who confuse access with power. You didn't argue your way out. You didn't fight your way free. You simply evolved past the environment that once defined you. And here's the part that punches their ego the hardest. They didn't lose power. You stopped giving it to them. Control only works on people who still believe they need approval. The moment you realized you could breathe without their validation, their influence collapsed. Some of you are wondering right now, why does it feel so lonely after this shift? Because when you leave a system built on control, you don't just lose the cage, you lose the crowd that applauded it. But chosen ones, loneliness is not a punishment. It's the quiet space where your real rhythm forms. You're no longer moving to their pace. You're no longer reacting to their noise. You're creating your own cadence, your own standards, your own rules. You act from center now, not from fear. You choose from clarity, not from old wounds. You speak from truth, not from survival mode. And that makes you dangerous to systems that depend on insecurity to function. Their world was never designed to handle someone who doesn't need it. Someone who can walk away without collapsing. Someone who doesn't chase, beg, or perform. Think about it like this. Their system is a machine that only works when people keep feeding it attention, emotion, and reaction. You unplugged yourself, and the machine started malfunctioning. That's why they're shaken. That's why they're confused. That's why they can't stop watching you from a distance, trying to figure out how you escaped without breaking. Here's a quote that cuts straight through the illusion. Freedom doesn't announce itself. It's felt by the ones who lost access to you. They can feel it, even if they never admit it. They sense that you've moved somewhere they can't reach, influence, or manipulate, and that terrifies them more than any confrontation ever could. Chosen ones, this shift wasn't accidental, it wasn't luck. It was earned. Every time you chose self-respect over approval, every time you stayed silent instead of reacting, every time you walked away instead of proving yourself, you were building immunity. You were preparing for this moment, the moment where their old reality no longer fits you, and your new reality no longer includes them. And now they can't unsee it. They saw you stop playing. They saw the game collapse. They saw the power drain from their hands, not because you took it, but because you no longer needed it. And once that happens, there's no going back. The shift is permanent. You didn't just leave their world, you made it irrelevant. Number 9. The realization they're still avoiding long after you moved on. The regret they bury deep because admitting it would break them. They didn't lose you. They lost the version of themselves that could have kept up. My dear chosen ones, this is the part they never talk about out loud. This is the quiet weight they carry when the noise dies down, when the rooms are empty, when the distractions fail. They didn't walk away because you were too much. They walked away because becoming the kind of person who could stand next to you required a level of honesty they weren't ready for, and that truth follows them everywhere. Here's what eats at them in silence. They know they could have walked beside you. They know they had a chance to grow with you instead of watching from the sidelines. They know they were close to something rare, something elevating, something that would have forced them to rise or be left behind. And instead of stepping up, they stepped back. Instead of evolving, they chose comfort. Instead of courage, they chose familiarity. And now they live with the consequences of that decision. You didn't shut them out. You didn't disappear without warning. You were open. You were real. You gave access with intention. You extended your hand not from need, but from sincerity, hoping someone would meet you at the level you were standing on. But they weren't built for that altitude. They weren't prepared for that level of truth. They weren't ready for the kind of self-examination that walking beside you would have demanded. Imagine this clearly, chosen ones. You were a door standing wide open, light pouring through, possibility flooding the room. And they stood behind the curtains telling themselves the light was too harsh. Not because it was dangerous, but because it would have exposed everything they were avoiding. They didn't want the fire that comes with growth. They wanted the dull safety of what they could already predict. They wanted easy. They wanted familiar. They wanted a life that didn't ask them to confront themselves. So they chose the safe route, the smaller route. The route that kept their ego comfortable and their growth frozen. At the time, it felt like relief. It felt like control. It felt like staying in power. But time has a way of flipping perspectives. And now that choice feels heavy. This is where the regret sets in. What keeps them awake late at night isn't missing you as a person. It's missing who they could have become. When they replay your old posts, your old words, your old presence, it's not nostalgia, it's self-interrogation. They're not searching for the moment you changed. They're searching for the moment they failed themselves. They scroll back, hoping to find the exact second where choosing differently might have changed everything. And every time they see how you've evolved, how you carry yourself now, how you move with self-respect and clarity, their own past choices start to look painfully small. That's when the realization hits them hardest. They weren't rejecting you back then. They were rejecting the future version of themselves that you would have forced them to become. That's a brutal thing to sit with. Here's the question that tightens their chest every time it crosses their mind. What would my life look like if I had matched their honesty, their courage, their pace? They don't like that question because it has no comforting answer. It points directly at the gap between who they are and who they could have been. Now they're on the outside, watching you move in a world they don't have access to. A world built on self-trust, not approval. A world where you don't perform to be accepted, where you don't apologize for existing, where you don't shrink to make others comfortable. They see what freedom looks like when someone earns it instead of begging for it, and it unsettles them. You walk unchained. You move untouched by the fear that still governs their decisions. You exist without constantly checking how you're being perceived. And that contrast is loud. It reminds them that comfort cost them growth, and silence cost them evolution. They'll never admit this part publicly, but they wish they had chosen differently. They wish they had chosen evolution when you did. They wish they had chosen truth instead of convenience. They wish they hadn't underestimated someone who was always destined to outgrow them. But here's the part that matters most for you, chosen ones. It's too late for them, and that's not your burden to carry. You didn't become untouchable by accident. You earned it through self-respect, through clarity, through choosing growth even when it was lonely. While they were preserving comfort, you were building strength. Now they're left wondering what it feels like to live the life you built. And you? You don't have to look back. And as we bring this full circle, take a moment to recognize what you've just seen unfold. This isn't just a story about being talked about or misunderstood. It's a reflection of what happens when you outgrow the limits placed on you. If this resonated, support this movement by liking the video, subscribing to the channel, and sharing it with someone who needs to hear it. Drop 77 in the comments if you know you were never meant to fit, only to rise. Your engagement helps us keep creating content that challenges, energizes, and speaks directly to those walking their own path. Stay connected. This isn't the end. It's the continuation.